On the morning of January 8, 1943, a maid named Alice Monaghan knocked on the door of room 3327 at the Hotel New Yorker in Manhattan. She had been asked not to disturb the guest for several days. He was old and preferred his privacy, and the staff had learned not to push the point. But something prompted her to knock that morning, and when there was no answer, she opened the door. Nikola Tesla was lying in his bed, undisturbed, the way he always slept, except that he had been dead for approximately 36 hours. He was 86 years old. He had invented the system that delivered electricity to nearly every home and factory in the developed world. He had designed the generators at Niagara Falls that still produce power today. He had been, in the 1890s, one of the most famous men in America, feted at dinners, photographed in laboratories, discussed in newspapers alongside Edison and Westinghouse, as one of the men who had genuinely changed what human civilization was capable of. He died alone in a hotel room with a debt he could not pay, and pigeons he had been feeding in Bryant Park because they were, in his final years, his primary companionship. Within hours of the announcement of his death, agents of the United States government arrived at the Hotel New Yorker and removed everything from his room. His notes, his papers, his experimental records, the contents of his safe. They were taken by the Office of Alien Property, acting on instructions from the FBI, which had classified the Tesla files at the highest level of secrecy. J. Edgar Hoover personally declared the contents of Tesla's room most secret. This is the story of how the man who lit the world ended up alone in a hotel room while government agents waited outside his door. It is the story of a war he won and a peace he lost. And it is the story of what was in those files, and what, depending on who you ask, may never have been returned. Nikola Tesla was born in 1856 in a village called Smiljan, in what is now Croatia, then part of the Austrian Empire. His father was a Serbian Orthodox priest, his mother an inventor of household tools who never filed a patent and never sought credit, a detail her son would have recognized later as a cautionary tale. He was brilliant from childhood in the specific way that certain kinds of minds are brilliant. Not generally clever, but acutely, sometimes terrifyingly precise about particular things. He could perform integral calculus in his head. He could memorize entire books. He had what he described as a visual imagination so vivid that when he conceived of a machine, he could run it in his mind, observe it operating, identify the points of stress and failure, and correct them before building a physical prototype. He came to America in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket, a letter of recommendation, and the plans for a new kind of electrical motor in his head. He had not yet built it. He did not need to. He had already run it thousands of times in the laboratory of his own mind and knew it worked. The letter of recommendation was to Thomas Edison. Edison read it, met Tesla, and hired him. For approximately a year, Tesla worked for Edison in New York, doing the unglamorous work of improving Edison's DC electrical systems, the work of a talented engineer operating in someone else's framework. He did it well. And at some point in that year, he presented Edison with his ideas about alternating current. The response is disputed in its particulars, but consistent in its substance. Edison was not interested. Edison's entire business was built on direct current. He had invested in it, lobbied for it, and sold it to cities across America. He had no interest in a system that would make that investment obsolete. He told Tesla that AC was impractical, that Americans didn't need it, and that if Tesla could improve his DC systems, he would pay him $50,000. Tesla improved the systems. Edison, according to Tesla's later account, told him the $50,000 had been a joke. He did not fully understand American humor yet. Tesla resigned. The difference between direct current and alternating current is not merely technical. It is the difference between 2 entirely different theories of how power should move through a civilization. Edison's DC system worked, but it worked only over short distances. A power station could supply electricity to customers within about a mile of its location. Beyond that, the voltage dropped too far to be useful. To electrify a city under DC, you needed power stations every few blocks, which meant massive infrastructure, massive cost, and massive ongoing maintenance. It was, in Edison's framing, the right system because it was controllable. Each station served its district, the company controlled the stations, and the customers were captive. Tesla's AC system was different in a fundamental way. Alternating current could be transformed. stepped up to very high voltages for long-distance transmission, then stepped back down at the destination for safe use. A single generating station could, in theory, supply electricity to a region. Multiple generating stations could, again in theory, be connected into a network covering an entire country. This was not a better version of Edison's idea. It was a replacement for it, and Edison understood that immediately. What followed, in the late 1880s and early 1890s, was one of the most unusual public relations campaigns in American industrial history. Edison hired engineers to publicly electrocute animals with alternating current, demonstrating its danger to crowds who gathered to watch. Stray dogs were collected from the streets and killed with AC in demonstrations designed for newspaper coverage. Edison recommended alternating current for use in New York State's new electric chair, publicly opposing capital punishment while privately calculating that if the first state execution used Westinghouse's current, people would associate AC with death. He proposed that electrocution by alternating current be called being Westinghoused. George Westinghouse, who had licensed Tesla's AC patents and was building the competing system, responded with engineering rather than theatre. He secured the contract to light the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago using Tesla's AC system. The fair drew 27 million visitors. The lights worked. The public saw, for the first time on that scale, what alternating current could do when it was allowed to do it. In 1895, the generating station at Niagara Falls, designed by Tesla, began delivering electricity to the city of Buffalo 26 miles away. The achievement was recognized as the decisive moment. AC had won. Edison lost the war of currents. He spent the rest of his long career making it appear in every interview he gave that he had never really lost, that the technical question had always been secondary to other considerations, that his real contributions were elsewhere. He lived until 1931 and died celebrated, decorated, and mythologized. Tesla won the war of currents. What happened to him after winning is the part of the story that doesn't get taught in schools. George Westinghouse was a fair man in the specific sense that matters in business. When he licensed Tesla's AC patents, he agreed to pay royalties. The royalties accumulated as the AC system expanded. By the early 1890s, the amounts Westinghouse owed Tesla were becoming significant, because the system was everywhere and every installation generated a payment. Edison lived until 1931, which meant that for 45 of the years during which Tesla was struggling without adequate funding, the man who had once told him the $50,000 was a joke was alive, celebrated, and decorated. The relationship between them in those decades was not a feud in the conventional sense. They did not exchange public insults. They did not correspond. They occupied, in the public imagination, different roles. Edison was the practical American inventor who had brought light to the world. Tesla was the brilliant visionary whose genius was celebrated in the abstract. The Edison Medal, the award that the American Institute of Electrical Engineers had given Tesla in 1916, and which bore the name of the man who'd been his employer and his antagonist, is perhaps the most concentrated symbol of how Tesla's place in the hierarchy of recognition had been arranged. The most significant honour his professional organisation could offer him bore the name of the man who had spent years trying to destroy the technology Tesla invented. Tesla gave a speech at the ceremony. He said Edison was a great man. He said it with the particular precision of someone who is describing something that is technically accurate and does not elaborate beyond what is technically accurate. There is one more detail about Edison and Tesla that belongs in any honest account of the relationship. In 1915, the New York Times reported that both Edison and Tesla were being considered for a joint Nobel Prize in physics. The report was based on credible sources and treated as serious news. The prize was not awarded to either of them. The Nobel records from that year have not been fully disclosed. What has been established is that the joint award did not happen, and that neither man ever received the prize. Edison received the Congressional Gold Medal in 1928. Tesla received a comparable Yugoslav honour in 1931. The American government's recognition of the man who had invented the system powering the American electrical grid was, in its substance, non-existent. Edison died in October 1931, 4 months after Tesla's 75th birthday celebration. The tributes were enormous. The New York Times ran his obituary across multiple pages. President Hoover considered asking the nation to turn off its electrical lights for 1 minute in Edison's honor. The plan was abandoned when someone pointed out that turning off the electrical lights would also turn off the pumping stations and hospitals. The pumping stations and hospitals ran on alternating current. Tesla sent a brief note of condolence to the Edison family. In 1897, Westinghouse came to Tesla with a problem. The company was under financial pressure. The construction of the Niagara Falls station had been expensive, the legal battles with Edison's successor companies had been expensive, and the royalty obligations to Tesla were becoming a strain on the balance sheet. Westinghouse asked Tesla if he would consider renegotiating the arrangement. Tesla thought about it. He had worked with Westinghouse for a decade. He believed Westinghouse had treated him honestly, and had championed his work when others dismissed it. He tore up the royalty contract. He received in exchange a cash settlement. The amount was never fully disclosed. What is clear is that it was a fraction of what the royalties would have been worth over the subsequent decades, as alternating current became the global standard for electrical power transmission. Tesla later said he had no regrets about the decision. He was not the kind of man who regretted things in any productive way. But the financial consequence of that torn contract was not abstract. It meant that the man whose patents underpinned the entire global electrical infrastructure would spend the next 45 years unable to fund the work he wanted to do. The money that should have been his was gone, and the work he wanted to do required more money than anything he had previously attempted. In 1901, Tesla began building a tower on Long Island. The site was a 200-acre property in a small town called Shoreham, which Tesla had purchased and named Wardenclyffe. The tower that rose from it was 187 feet tall, topped with a 55-ton copper dome. It was designed by Stanford White, the most fashionable architect in America, who would be murdered 5 years later at Madison Square Garden in one of the most sensational crimes of the Gilded Age. The tower was funded by J.P. Morgan, who had provided $150,000 in exchange for 51% of any patents that came from the work. Morgan believed he was funding a wireless communication system that would compete with Marconi's transatlantic radio. Tesla had sold it to him on those terms. What Tesla was actually building was something else. His goal, which he revealed to Morgan in 1903 after construction was underway, and the scope of the project had grown considerably beyond what the original investment covered, was to use the Wardenclyffe Tower to transmit electrical power wirelessly. Not messages, power. The concept was to use the Earth itself as a conductor, to pump energy into the ground at Wardenclyffe and have it emerge anywhere on the planet that a receiver had been installed. Free wireless electricity, anywhere on Earth. Morgan's response in a letter that still exists was brief. "I have received your letter, and in reply would say that I should not feel disposed at present to make any further advances." This is where the conspiracy theory version of the Tesla story usually begins. Morgan, who had significant investments in the copper wire industry and the companies that sold metered electricity, saw that Tesla's system would eliminate the need for both. He pulled the funding to protect his financial interests. The tower was the technology that would have liberated humanity from centralized energy control, and it was strangled by a banker who preferred that energy remain centralized. Here is what the documentary record shows. Morgan's investments in copper and electricity were real. He absolutely had financial reasons to be unenthusiastic about a system that transmitted power wirelessly. That much of the conspiracy theory is not wrong. What the record also shows is that Tesla had violated the terms of his contract with Morgan by building a wireless power facility when Morgan had funded a wireless communications facility. Morgan had reasonable grounds to decline further investment on those terms alone, separate from any concern about his other holdings. What the record also shows is that even had Morgan continued funding, the physics of wireless power transmission at a global scale were not solved in 1903 and have not been solved since. The Wardenclyffe system, as Tesla described it, would have faced energy loss problems that current engineering cannot fully address. The tower might have been built. It might even have worked at some limited scale. Whether it would have done what Tesla claimed is a question that cannot be answered from the available evidence. What can be said with certainty is this. When Morgan withdrew, the other investors who might have stepped in looked at Morgan's decision and stepped back. Morgan was the signal. When the richest man in America declined to continue, the rest of the market made its calculation. the tower stood for another decade slowly deteriorating. Tesla took out mortgages on the Wardenclyffe property to cover his living expenses. In 1917, the tower was demolished. The materials were sold for scrap. The proceeds went toward Tesla's debts. He received nothing. In 1899, 2 years before Wardenclyffe, Tesla went to Colorado. He had secured funding, modest by his standards, from the financier Leonard Curtis and from the Colorado Springs Electric Company, which agreed to provide him with unlimited power for his experiments in exchange for any useful findings. He built a laboratory on the outskirts of Colorado Springs, a large wooden building with a retractable roof, containing equipment that the local electrical infrastructure had never been asked to support. What Tesla did in Colorado Springs over the following 8 months was simultaneously the most spectacular experimental work of his career, and the beginning of the end of his financial stability. He built a Tesla coil of unprecedented size. The primary coil was more than 50 feet in diameter. The secondary coil rose through the roof of the building, topped by a copper sphere. The system was designed to resonate at the frequency of the Earth itself, to use the planet as a conductor for electrical energy in the way that a tuning fork uses air. When he ran it at full power, the discharges from the sphere were enormous. Sparks flew from the ground in a radius around the building. The grass lit up with blue electrical flame. A butterfly, according to one account, was seen flying through a room of electrical fire unharmed. The Colorado Springs Electric Company's generator burned out from the demand. Tesla, in his laboratory notes from Colorado Springs, which are detailed and strange and among the most remarkable scientific documents of the early 20th century, recorded observations that he believed confirmed his theory, that the Earth was a resonant electrical conductor, that energy put into it at the right frequency would propagate through it, and that it could be extracted anywhere on the planet by a properly tuned receiver. He also, in Colorado Springs, believed he received a signal, not from the grid, not from any terrestrial transmitter, a rhythmic, ordered signal, unlike anything that electrical interference would produce, that he believed was too structured to be natural and too regular to be random. He speculated in his notes, and in a subsequent interview, that the signal might be extraterrestrial. He suggested it might be from Mars. He did not publish this claim formally, which was uncharacteristic for a man who usually published his results. He mentioned it in an interview with a journalist in 1901, and then declined to elaborate further, and the claim became one of the stranger footnotes in his biography, neither substantiated nor satisfactorily explained. What the signal was, if it was anything beyond the artifacts that high-powered electrical experiments sometimes produce, is not known. What Tesla took from Colorado Springs, beyond the notes and the burned-out generator and whatever he had heard in the signal, was the conviction that Wardenclyffe was possible, that the Earth could carry current, that the experiment had worked. He returned to New York and found J.P. Morgan. The years between Wardenclyffe and the Hotel New Yorker are the years that the official narrative of Tesla most consistently elides, because they do not fit either the tragedy arc or the celebration arc that his story is usually told in. He kept working. He had ideas, genuinely interesting ideas, and he pursued them with the same intensity he had always brought to his work. He announced, periodically, that he was on the verge of breakthroughs, a turbine that would revolutionize power generation, a system for controlling weather, a particle beam weapon he called the death ray that could destroy aircraft at enormous distances. The announcements were taken seriously by the press because Tesla's track record justified taking him seriously. They were taken less seriously by the scientific establishment because the announcements were never accompanied by working prototypes, and because Tesla's relationship with mathematical rigor had always been unusual in ways that both served him and limited him. He had always worked primarily through visual intuition, rather than through formal mathematical derivation. This was the quality that had allowed him to design machines in his mind and build them correctly on the first attempt. It was also the quality that made it difficult for him to communicate his ideas to the scientific community in terms they could evaluate, and that made some of his later claims genuinely difficult to distinguish from the ideas of a great mind operating beyond the edge of what he could rigorously support. He moved from hotel to hotel. The Waldorf Astoria, where he had lived during the Wardenclyffe years, and where the hotel eventually foreclosed on the property to cover his debts, was behind him. The Hotel St. Regis for a time. Eventually the Hotel New Yorker, where Westinghouse Electric, recognizing something that resembled obligation, paid for his room until his death. He fed the pigeons in Bryant Park. He had always liked birds, but in his final decade the pigeons became something more than a habit. He tended to them with a care that the people around him found both touching and slightly alarming. He had particular favourites. When a white pigeon he had named and cared for died, he described it to a journalist with a grief that was more visible than anything he had shown about the collapse of Wardenclyffe. He walked to the park every day that he could. He was old and thin, and the city moved around him with the indifference that cities have toward old men who were once famous and are now merely present. The OCD that had been a professional asset in his earlier years had become, by his final decade, consuming. He would not touch circular objects. He could not eat at a table where another person had used the cutlery. He required 18 napkins precisely arranged before he would begin a meal. He calculated the cubic volume of his food before eating it. He orbited the block 3 times before entering a building. The Hotel New Yorker staff accommodated these requirements. He was still a famous man, and famous men are accommodated. In the final years, Tesla claimed he had solved problems that would matter enormously if the claims were true. The death ray, which he described in enough technical detail to interest military authorities, was said to be a particle beam weapon capable of destroying any aircraft at long range. He offered it to the major governments of Europe in the 1930s as a defensive weapon, a technology that could make national borders impenetrable by air attack. Several governments expressed interest. None provided funding. He claimed to have developed a system for transmitting electrical power through the earth without wires. Not the Wardenclyffe system, which had been abandoned, but a refined version based on decades of additional thought. He claimed to have developed improvements to turbine technology that would dramatically increase the efficiency of power generation. The documents that would have contained the detailed specifications for these claims were in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker when Tesla died on January 7th, 1943. The morning after his death, his nephew, Sava Kozanovic, arrived at the hotel. Kozanovic was a Yugoslav diplomat with, according to American intelligence assessments at the time, Communist Party connections. The concern was that Tesla's papers, particularly any specifications for weapon systems, might end up in Soviet hands through Kozanovic. The Office of Alien Property, acting on FBI instructions, seized the contents of the room. J. Edgar Hoover declared the files most secret. An electrical engineer named John G. Trump, who was the uncle of a future president of the United States, was brought in to review Tesla's papers and assess their military significance. Trump's assessment, delivered after a review of the seized materials, was that they contained nothing of significant scientific or military value. Nothing of significant scientific or military value. The man who had invented the system that powered the modern world, who had claimed in his final years to have developed a particle beam weapon capable of changing the nature of warfare, whose files had been seized at the highest level of national security urgency, had left behind nothing that the government's expert considered worth pursuing. 2 possibilities follow from Trump's assessment. The first is that Tesla's later claims were the products of a brilliant mind that had, in old age, lost its connection to the rigorous work that had produced his earlier breakthroughs. That the death ray and the wireless power refinements were ideas he could not have built, specifications that did not work, the output of a visionary who had outrun the mathematics. The second is that the files Trump reviewed were not all the files, that something had been removed from room 3027 before the Office of Alien Property arrived, that the inventory of what was seized does not match the inventory of what should have been there. There are researchers who have spent decades arguing for the second interpretation. The FBI files, which were declassified in 2016, contain several passages with names and content redacted. There are references in the documents to papers reviewed by naval intelligence that are not accounted for in the public record. The safe from Tesla's hotel room, according to some accounts, contained manuscripts that have not appeared in Belgrade, where most of the returned materials eventually ended up, or anywhere else. Whether something was taken and kept, or whether Trump was simply right that the later work was not what Tesla claimed it was, cannot be determined from the available evidence. What can be determined is that the question has never been fully answered, and that the agency which seized the files, and the official who declared them most secret, and the expert who reviewed them and found nothing, all had reasons, separate and distinct, to produce an outcome in which nothing further needed to be disclosed. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is an observation about incentives. What the declassified FBI files actually contain is worth sitting with for a moment, because they are not what either the conspiracy theorists or the official dismissal suggest. The files run to approximately 156 pages. They cover a period from 1940, when Hoover began receiving correspondence about Tesla's work, through to the 1980s, when researchers were still trying to establish where the materials had gone. What they show is that the government took Tesla's work seriously enough to act within hours of his death, and then spent 40 years telling inquirers it had never been in possession of the papers. In 1950, Hoover himself wrote a letter stating that the FBI had never been in possession of Tesla's papers. The Office of Alien Property had them. This was technically accurate. It was also the kind of accuracy that produces the same effect as a direct denial. The papers that were returned to Yugoslavia after review ended up in the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade. The museum's curators, over the decades, have published and analysed much of what was returned. What they have also noted, carefully and without dramatic claims, is that the inventories do not fully match, that there are references in American documents to materials that are not in the Belgrade collection, that some things appear to have been retained. The Naval Research Laboratory and the Office of Naval Intelligence were both present at the examination of Tesla's papers in January 1943. Their role is documented. What they took from that examination, if anything, is not. Trump's assessment that the papers contained nothing of significant military value was delivered quickly, within days of the seizure, for a collection of documents that Edgar Hoover had classified as most secret. The review was conducted with a speed that later researchers have found notable. None of this resolves the question. The honest position is that something was taken, some of it was returned, some of it may not have been, and the agencies involved have not provided the documentation that would settle the matter. The conspiracy theory version says this is because the technology was real and was suppressed. The official version says Trump was right and there was nothing worth suppressing. Neither version can be fully proven from the available evidence. What can be said is that the man who lit the world left behind documents that the most powerful law enforcement official in America personally classified as most secret, and that the subsequent accounting of those documents does not fully add up. That observation does not require any additional dramatic framing. It is, on its own, enough. The legacy that Tesla left is not primarily in the files, it is in the infrastructure. Every alternating current system in the world, every power grid, every generator, every motor that runs on AC, operates according to principles that Tesla worked out in the 1880s and that he demonstrated at Niagara Falls in 1895. The system he designed is so foundational that most people who use it every day have no idea who designed it, which is itself a kind of testimony to how completely his work was absorbed into the background of modern life. The Nobel Prize for Physics in 1909 was shared by Marconi for wireless telegraphy. Tesla had prior patents on several of the relevant technologies, and the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1943, the year of his death, that Tesla had indeed held prior art on the basic radio patents. The ruling came too late to affect the Nobel, and too late to affect the royalties, and it arrived in the same year that the man himself was found dead in a hotel room. Edison received the Congressional Gold Medal in 1928. He received honorary degrees from multiple universities. He was present at the ceremony when Thomas Edison National Historical Park was created during his lifetime. He is in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Tesla received no Nobel Prize. He received the Edison Medal from the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in 1916, an award named for the man who had told him that the $50,000 had been a joke. He accepted it. The Nobel Prize Committee records from 1915, which have since been partially examined by researchers, suggest that both Tesla and Edison were under consideration for a joint award that year. The joint award did not happen. The specific reason has never been established. Neither man received the prize. The Westinghouse Electric Company paid Tesla's rent at the Hotel New Yorker until he died. The amount was modest. It was not the royalties from his torn contract. It was a hotel room. On the night of July 14th, 1903, Nikola Tesla powered up his tower at Wardenclyffe for what would be the last time at full capacity. The electrical discharges from the dome were visible from Long Island Sound. Residents of Shoreham and the surrounding towns came out of their houses to watch. The flashes were described in the New York papers the following day as resembling lightning, as blinding streaks that shot off into the darkness on some mysterious errand. Tesla and his staff gave no explanation. He never powered it up like that again. What he was doing that night, what he was trying to demonstrate, whether it was a last attempt to show Morgan what the technology could do, or a final test of a theory he would never have the resources to pursue further, is not in the record. The tower stood for 14 more years, slowly becoming a landmark of intention rather than operation. A large thing on the Long Island skyline that had been built to change the world and had changed nothing, because the man who built it had told the wrong story to the wrong investor at the wrong moment. In 1917, it was demolished. The materials were sold for scrap to pay debts that amounted to $20,000. $20,000. The tower that was going to transmit electricity to the entire planet was worth $20,000 in scrap. Tesla was 61 years old when the tower came down. He lived for another 26 years. He never built anything on that scale again. Not because the ideas were gone, the ideas were never gone, but because the money was gone, and the money had been gone since 1903, and the torn contract with Westinghouse had ensured that it would stay gone. He had won the war of currents. He had lost everything that came after. Room 3327, 33rd floor, Hotel New Yorker. The pigeons he had been feeding were still in Bryant Park when the agents arrived. Nobody went to feed them that day. The files were taken, the safe was opened, the assessment was delivered, nothing of significant scientific or military value. The Supreme Court ruled that Tesla held the prior patents on radio. The ruling was too late. His name is on an electric car company. The irony of this, that the man who worked in alternating current and despised Edison's direct current is commemorated primarily by a company that runs on DC battery power, is the kind of irony that the story of Nikola Tesla seems to generate without effort. He died in debt. He died alone. He died without children and without a will and without any of the institutional recognition that accrues, in his field, to men like Edison, who understood that the politics of invention are as important as the invention. He had understood something about electricity that nobody else fully grasped in his lifetime. He had designed the infrastructure that would run the 20th century. He had done it, in large part by tearing up the contract that would have paid him for it. What was in the files the government took and did not fully return. What he knew, the world is still using. Those two facts sit together in a way that does not resolve neatly. They rarely do, with men like this. Tesla arrived in America in June 1884 with what he later described as 4 cents, a few of his own poems, and knowledge of 11 languages. The letter he carried to Edison had been written by Charles Batchelor, one of Edison's most trusted engineers who had worked with Tesla in Paris. The letter said, in its entirety, "I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." Edison read the letter. He met Tesla. He gave him a job improving the direct current dynamos that powered his growing electrical empire. Tesla was 27 years old. He'd grown up in a village with no electrical infrastructure at all, and had arrived in a city that was being rewired from the ground up. Manhattan in 1884 was Edison's laboratory. The Pearl Street station had been operating for 2 years, delivering direct current to customers in Lower Manhattan, and the expansion was ongoing. Edison's teams were digging trenches, laying wire, connecting buildings to the grid that Edison's investors believed would pay for itself many times over. Tesla worked on the dynamos. He improved them. He solved problems that had frustrated Edison's engineers because he could see the problems in 3 dimensions in his mind and manipulate them before touching the hardware. He worked 18-hour days because the work was interesting and because he was the kind of person for whom sleep was a competitor to the thing he actually wanted to be doing. Edison noticed. Edison liked people who worked like that. He told Tesla he would pay him $50,000 if he could solve a specific set of problems with the DC system, problems that had been resisting solution and that represented a significant amount of money if fixed. Tesla fixed them. Edison told him the $50,000 had been a joke. Americans, Edison explained, had a particular sense of humor that recent immigrants sometimes found difficult to interpret. Tesla resigned. He spent the following year digging ditches for the Edison Electric Company as a laborer, because he needed to eat, and the only engineering work available to him was in the Edison system, and he was not yet in a position to build anything independently. He dug ditches in Manhattan while the ideas for alternating current systems developed in his mind with a completeness that he found simultaneously exciting and frustrating, because the ideas were fully formed and he had no way to build them. A group of investors eventually approached him with funding to start a laboratory. The agreement fell through. He was alone again. Then George Westinghouse heard him speak. The 1888 meeting of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, where Tesla presented his paper on a new system of alternating current motors and transformers, is one of those historical moments that was not recognized as pivotal while it was happening, and became pivotal in retrospect. Tesla stood before the assembled engineers and described a system that used the phase relationships between alternating currents to produce a rotating magnetic field. The rotating field could drive a motor without brushes, without the mechanical contact that made DC motors wear out and spark and require constant maintenance. The system was elegant in the specific way that things are elegant when they solve multiple problems simultaneously with a single insight. Westinghouse was in the audience, or had read the paper shortly after. He contacted Tesla within weeks. He offered to license the patents and to pay Tesla to work at his Pittsburgh facility until the system was fully implemented. Tesla moved to Pittsburgh. He found it difficult. He was accustomed to solitary work, to the specific rhythm of his own mind, operating on problems without interruption. Westinghouse's facility was full of engineers who had their own ways of doing things and who had reasonable professional resistance to the ideas of a newcomer, however brilliant. Tesla spent approximately a year in Pittsburgh and then negotiated an arrangement that allowed him to work from New York instead, where he built his own laboratory on Grand Street. The Westinghouse Company implemented the AC system. The patents were Tesla's, the royalties were accumulating, and then came the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. The contract to illuminate the fair was the central battlefield of the War of Currents. Edison's successor company, General Electric, submitted a bid. Westinghouse submitted a bid using Tesla's AC system. General Electric's bid was higher because the copper required for DC transmission at that scale was expensive. Westinghouse won the contract. 27 million people attended the fair. The electrical display was the centerpiece. For the first time, most of those 27 million people saw what electrical illumination looked like at scale. Not the few blocks around a DC station, but an entire fairground blazing with light. Tesla performed demonstrations in the electrical building that involved passing high-frequency currents through his body to make light tubes glow, which audiences found somewhere between miraculous and terrifying. He lit phosphorescent tubes wirelessly by standing in a high-frequency field. The Niagara Falls contract followed. The generators bore Tesla's name. The current began flowing to Buffalo. The War of Currents was over. Tesla had won. There is a scene that Tesla described to a journalist late in his life from his time in Colorado Springs in 1899 that does not appear in most biographies and that deserves to be in any honest account of his later years. He was alone in the laboratory one night, monitoring the signals produced by his enormous coil. The coil was not running at full power. He was listening, through his instruments, to the electromagnetic environment, and he heard something. He described it as a series of rhythmic pulses, regular and repeating, unlike the noise that natural electrical phenomena produce. Lightning produces random crackling. Interference from nearby sources has a characteristic signature that experienced experimenters learned to identify. This was different. The pulses were too regular. They came in groups that suggested a pattern. 1, 2, 3, a pause, repeating. He sat with it for a long time. He checked his equipment. He moved through the possible explanations. He had, at that point in his career, more experience with high-frequency electromagnetic phenomena than any person alive. He had built and operated equipment that no one else had attempted. He knew what interference looked like. He knew what atmospheric noise looked like. He believed he knew what this looked like, and he believed it was none of those things. He wrote in his notebook, "The feeling is constantly growing on me that I had been the first to hear the greeting of one planet to another." He mentioned it once to a journalist in 1901. He said he believed he had received signals from Mars, which was consistent with the astronomical thinking of the period about possible Martian civilization. He did not elaborate. He did not publish it. He moved on to Wardenclyffe. What he heard in Colorado Springs, whether it was an artifact of his equipment, an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, or something that the science of 1899 had no framework to identify, is not recorded in a way that permits evaluation. The notebook entry is real. The experience was real. What produced it is the question that, like several questions in the Tesla story, has no answer in the available record. He was the most rigorous experimental physicist of his generation. He was also alone in a laboratory at altitude, with the most powerful electromagnetic equipment on Earth, hearing something he had not heard before, and he formed a hypothesis about it. The hypothesis may have been wrong, it probably was. But the fact that he heard something, and that he said so, once, quietly, and then kept working, is the most Tesla thing in the entire Tesla story. He did not announce it. He did not build a campaign around it. He noted it, filed it in the category of things he did not yet understand, and continued doing the work. The Hotel New Yorker, where Tesla spent his final decade, is still standing. It is a hotel. It has been other things in the intervening decades, but it is a hotel again now, and the room on the 33rd floor where he died is noted on the hotel's website as a point of historical interest. You can book a room there. The pigeons in Bryant Park are still there, or their descendants are. The park is 4 blocks from the hotel, which is the same distance it was when Tesla walked there every day to feed them. The city has changed around the park in the 80 years since his death, but the park itself is roughly what it was. He walked those 4 blocks every day that he was able. He was old and thin and sometimes used a cane. The staff at the hotel knew his route and worried about him on the days when he was later than usual. He had no children, no partner, no family in the country. The hotel staff were the closest thing to a daily social world that he had. He talked to the pigeons. He gave some of them names. He could recognize individuals and knew their particular behaviors and preferences in the way that someone who has spent time with animals learns to read them. When the white pigeon he had especially loved died, he described her to a journalist with a detail and a grief that he had never applied to any of his professional losses. He said she had come to him, and he had known, somehow, that she was dying. He said he had held her. He said that when she died, something in him had died too, something that had kept him going. He did not say he was sad about Wardenclyffe with that specificity. He did not say he was sad about the torn contract with Westinghouse with that specificity. He had a philosophical relationship with professional loss that kept it at a certain distance from the thing he actually felt, the pigeon he allowed in. He was 82 years old when the pigeon died. He had 4 more years to live. He continued going to the park. He continued feeding the others, but the one he had loved was gone, and he did not pretend otherwise. Room 3327, 33rd floor, January 7th, 1943. The date matters in a way that tends to get lost in the storytelling. January 7th, 1943 was not a quiet day in American history. The United States had been at war for 13 months. The Pacific was burning. The Atlantic was being crossed by German submarines that were sinking Allied shipping at a rate that threatened the entire logistics of the war. North Africa was contested. The Manhattan Project, though Tesla could not have known it, was 6 months from becoming a full-scale operation. Into this context, in a hotel room in Manhattan, an 86-year-old man who had once claimed to have developed a weapon that could destroy aircraft at 1,000 miles died quietly of a heart attack. The government arrived the next morning. The war was the reason they gave. The death ray was the technology they cited. The classification was the highest Hoover could impose, and then the experts said there was nothing there. The war continued. The Manhattan Project produced what it produced. The death ray, if it had ever existed in a form that worked, was not the weapon that ended the war. Whether it had ever existed in a form that worked is the question that the files were supposed to answer, and, according to the official record, did answer in the negative. The FBI released what it had in 2016. The researchers who read it noted the redactions and the gaps in the inventories that did not fully match. They continue to note them. The Tesla Museum in Belgrade has what it has, and scholars use it, and it is extensive. And somewhere between what was there and what was returned is a gap that no one has officially accounted for. Not conspiracy theory. A gap. He lit the world. He died in the dark. The government took the files. The expert said there was nothing. Draw your own conclusions.